When they saw the swarm of bugs coming, many of them ran away, screaming in panic. They didn't pay attention to anyone else, only caring about saving their own skin. Ah! They're so big! Run! Charles didn't spare those people a second thought. His priority was to protect those who were able to remain calm and help him fight. After all, faced with this number of enemies, they had little chance of escape. Anyone who ran away was bound to fall prey to the insects, so the only solution was to seek strength in numbers. Everyone in the Dawn Alliance had weapons, so the paranormals shot at the swarm, taking down one insect after another. Other brave warriors joined in, including Tina and Harper. Elena fought with such hatred that she seemed almost as strong as a surgically enhanced paranormal. Although the bugs were relatively weak, it wasn't as though they could be cut down with a single strike, so it was important that defenders didn't lose their focus. Charles didn't use any of his internal energy, relying instead on his blood-drinking sword and his agility to dispatch as many of the bugs as he could. Alice and Sylvia played a supporting role, knowing there would be plenty of opportunity to display their strength later. They knew they would get through this as long as they didn't panic. Taking a step away from the fight, Charles called, "I'll distract the bugs. Everyone hurry up and pack your things. I'll give you 10 minutes and then we'll escape. Remember, take only what you need. If you bring too much, then don't expect me to carry it for you." The others followed his orders, packing their belongings and preparing to escape. They had been unhappy when Alice had woken them up, but then Charles had stalled the bugs, giving everyone a chance to pack. So they were grateful for the early warning. After all, if they'd been attacked by those monsters in their sleep, then many of them might not have lived through the night. They were soon ready. Some had packed bags, while others had bundled their things in a bedsheet, trying to take as much as possible. When Charles saw them, he sighed. Clearly they hadn't made an escape plan, so even working together, their lack of preparation might well doom them to failure. Just as Charles was about to give the next order, Dean said, "We've hundreds of people, but only a few cars. How are we going to transport everyone?" Uncertainty spread through the crowd. "He's right. Even when you factor in the other leaders as cars, we don't have enough vehicles. There are hundreds of people here, including families. How can we evacuate them all?" "Can he really take us all? How?" When things became desperate, people often lost their cool and grew suspicious of those around them. So when they realized they didn't have enough cars, they began to doubt Charles could help them at all, and they couldn't see how he was going to get them away from there. Charles glared at Dean. As far as he was concerned, people like Dean were nothing but trouble. It was one thing for him to have spotted the problem, but by announcing it to the group like that, he was turning everyone against one another. Olivia stood up and said, "I don't know if I can help everyone escape, but I promise that whatever happens, we'll advance or retreat as a team." Charles turned to Tina. "Put all our things in the armored cars. Hank, Hugh, and Tommy can drive. The rest of the people will stay behind to stop the insects." They started loading up one of the cars, and Dean shouted, "Do you want us to load supplies too? That would leave us with nothing. And the more supplies we load, the less room there is for people." Charles had lived through this before. Although he didn't care about abandoning anyone, the people were still useful to him, so it wasn't time to leave them. "If you're with me," he snapped at Dean, "then do as I say. If not, you can get lost. I'm not getting in the car, and the same goes for all Alliance members. If these people don't have supplies when they get where they're going, then how are they going to survive? And if we're busy moving supplies around, then how are we going to defend against the insects?" "You're a paranormal," said Dean. "Even if you don't get in the car, you're powerful enough that you can follow them later. What happens to us then? Will we just be left behind to feed the insects?" That was enough to sow the seeds of doubt among the group once more, and they began to wonder if Charles was lying to them. Was he tricking them into loading the car with supplies so that he could jump in at the last moment and leave them all behind, taking all their belongings with him? Others remained loyal to Charles. They stood behind Olivia and the other respected members of the Alliance, but they didn't dare make a sound. Alice was livid, and her face was flushed. "We put our lives on the line protecting you," she shouted, "and this is how you treat us? If I hadn't woken you up, then you'd already be feeding the insects." The doubters stood there, looking around uneasily. "But how do we know you're not tricking us?" one of them called out. "If I haven't convinced you already," said Charles, "then I never will. If you believe in me, then believe in me. If not, then we part ways here." With that, many of the doubters began to nod, finally won over. It wasn't like they had much of a choice in the matter. They knew they couldn't escape without the protection of these paranormals. But then someone shouted, "Let's force him to come with us. If we smash up the car, then he'll have to come with us." It was as if the crowd had been waiting for a cry like this to finally give in to their baser impulses. When the chips were down, it didn't take much for people to lose their minds. And so the crowd took up their weapons and descended on the vehicle. Lena was stunned to see the people approaching the car. She had seen a lot of cruelty in the world in these last few days, but this was the first time she had witnessed the appalling behavior of human beings. Do they really mean to smash the car so that Charles is forced to travel with them? She wondered. Hank and the others were also at a loss, and they didn't know what to do. The crowd was large, and they were armed with weapons Charles had given them. Although a few showed signs of hesitation, most were already past the point of reason. The Alliance didn't have much time to think. They were guided by the principle that they either lived together or died together. Although Charles could understand their reasons, that didn't mean he could forgive them. He took out a gun and shouted, "I'll shoot anyone who lays a finger on that car." Many of the people stopped in their tracks. They had heard about the time Charles had fired on the Summers family in front of everyone, so when he threatened to do the same now, they believed him. "What's there to be afraid of?" someone asked. "There are many of us and only one of him." With that, he led a dozen or so of the others to charge at the car. Charles saw red. Some people just don't know what's good for them, he thought. Not until it's time to die, anyway. A series of gunshots rang out, and the people at the front of the charge fell to the ground. The rest of the crowd called out, "He's killed someone! He really has! Run!" More than 20 had fallen, which was enough to scare the others out of their wits. Some of them fled, but there were others who refused to leave. Becoming enemies with someone as merciless as Charles was extremely dangerous, but following him gave them a sense of security. "We have paranormals, guns, and ammunition," Olivia called out. "If it came down to it, do you really think you'd stand a chance against us?" Her words had the desired effect, and many in the crowd caught her drift. It was clear that if Charles really wanted to kill them, then he would have done so already. Charles said, "I guarantee that the paranormals will stay with the vehicles and protect them, but no paranormals are allowed to get inside the cars. The rest of you can decide for yourselves whether you want to put your things in the cars or keep them on you, but don't blame me if you fall behind." A man shouted out, "I believe you." He approached the car and threw his bags inside, "But you need to promise not to play any more tricks on us." The crowd was restless, waiting to see what would happen next. Olivia stepped forward. "Where do you think we got the zombie serum from?" she asked. "Or the food and water we purchased with crystal cores? Or the new clothes we gave you over the last few days?" After a pause, she said, "We got them from Charles." There were gasps and mutters throughout the crowd. "Really?" asked the man standing beside the car. "Don't lie to us." "It's the truth," said Olivia. "You were given these things by the Alliance leaders, but where do you think they got them from?" At last, everyone understood. The leaders had wanted to push Charles out of the picture, so of course they had tried to take the credit for themselves. But after having spent more time with the leaders, it was clear they couldn't have sourced these things themselves. Olivia continued, "The leaders only share these things with a few people close to them, even when they have enough supplies to last a few years." The atmosphere was tense, and Dean and those around him kept quiet. They hadn't really wanted to destroy the vehicles. After all, traveling by car would be much faster than the alternative. They had only wanted to challenge Charles, to get an idea of his limits, and they hadn't expected things to get to this stage. And so, following Olivia's speech, they were beginning to see the wisdom of following Charles. Someone screamed. A thin man clutched his waist where a bug had landed. He hadn't even noticed it at first, but when he did, he cried out, "The bugs are back! Hurry up and kill them!" The group fell into chaos once more. Those who still had their wits about them picked up their weapons and started to fight back. Any time he had found himself bored in the fortress, Charles had passed the time by crafting simple swords from the materials he had found outside. He had made a sufficient number to arm everyone here. Even so, some people panicked and went screaming and running into the dark. A flying bug with a red shell appeared from the shadows and lunged at one of the men. This bug was enormous, half the size of a person, and the man sliced at it with a sword. "Take that!" he yelled. The beetle clamped its pincers around the long blade and bit it off. The man stared, stunned at the broken blade in his hand, and then he ran to Charles yelling, "Help!" "Earth wall," Charles shouted. One of the Earth Paranormals summoned a stone wall to block the flying insects. Then, to his shock, a large hole appeared in the stone as the red beetle drilled through it. "Firebird!" cried Charles. A fire paranormal summoned a bird engulfed in flames. It flapped its crimson wings and launched itself at the bug, turning it into a fireball. Great. Oh no. Before Charles could celebrate, he discovered that the bug had escaped from the flames, completely unsinged. When the others saw the bug flying toward them, they panicked, throwing their powers at the creature one after another. "It must be their leader," someone cried. Charles shouted, "Get out of the way. Let me handle this." Everyone scrambled to get out of Charles's way. After all, if the monster couldn't even be killed by a paranormal, then they really didn't want to take it on. The nearby paranormals looked on in surprise. They had tried everything within their power to hurt this bug, but with no success. They wondered if Charles might be successful where they had failed. It was certainly possible. No matter how formidable the monsters were, Charles always seemed to spot some weakness and exploit it. Of course, he had certainly had enough experience fighting the monsters to learn their habits. In the time they had been on Charles's side, the monsters seemed to have grown weaker. Charles held the blood-drinking sword in one hand and rushed to face the monster. A dozen bugs, each the size of a human head, pounced at Charles, attacking him. "Be careful, Charles! Watch out, brother!" Calling from the sidelines, Lena, Alice, and the other paranormals threw a few ice and wind blades at the insects, but their attacks only managed to take out a few of the creatures. They despaired as even more bugs appeared and surrounded Charles. Everyone began to talk at once. "That isn't good. He's in danger. Who's going to save him? We need to protect ourselves, too. These bugs are everywhere." There was danger all around, and they glanced about, trying to find a safe spot. But the insects were coming from all directions, and in their effort to defend themselves, there was no way to help Charles, too. "Dance of the fire snake," Charles cried out. A long fire snake appeared beside him, sticking out its tongue and biting at the swarm of insects. Wherever the fire snake attacked, the insects exploded into balls of flame. Charles stabbed at the insect commander with his blood-drinking sword. The commander was a crustacean insect, so although it was relatively small, it had a rock-hard carapace. At this stage of its evolution, it was immune to most elemental damage. But over time, Charles's blood-drinking sword had grown so powerful that even he was in awe of it. After the snake's fire had died away, he brought the sword down on the commander, piercing its body as though slicing paper. His expert swordsmanship made short work of the insect, and moments later, he took the crystal core from its body. As the crowd witnessed Charles's miraculous performance, they broke into cheers. "Great! He got it! Did you see that? He's so powerful! He's invincible!" The combined forces of the paranormals hadn't been enough to defeat the monster, but Charles had managed it with a single stroke of his sword. Everyone was awestruck. Charles ignored their amazement. "Go," he ordered. "These insects come in all shapes and sizes, so we need to make sure we're tackling them sensibly. Leave the ordinary types to the martial artists. That way the paranormals can preserve their strength for when the stronger bugs show up." With his one sword stroke, he had won the hearts of the group, so no one would dare to disobey his orders. A car engine turned on, and some sharp-eyed people noticed the vehicle pulling away. They knew Charles hadn't given orders for anyone to leave, so they began to yell, "Someone's leaving! We can't let him escape! Quick, stop him!" "Are you kidding me?" Oliver asked. "That's an armored vehicle." They had all rallied around their leader, so they weren't about to watch someone flee the scene. Besides, their supplies were in the vehicle, and they didn't want to lose those. But they didn't know what to do. They didn't dare use their bodies to block the vehicle. Of course, they could attack it, but the car was Charles's property. A few of the paranormals looked at him, waiting to see what he wanted them to do. After watching him dispatch an enemy with a single sword stroke, they weren't about to make a decision without his say-so. Charles glared at the armored car, knowing Dean was the person inside it. He strode forward, chasing after the vehicle. When Charles had rushed the monster, Dean had known his future would be bleak. Others had thought Charles was courting death by doing so, but Dean hadn't thought so. He didn't believe for a second that someone as smart as Charles would take such a risk if he wasn't sure of the outcome. Drivers had been waiting in 4 of the armored vehicles, but the other 2 hadn't been allocated drivers, so Dean had taken one of those. Luck had been on his side. The key had been inside the vehicle, meaning he could escape successfully with his companions. Just as they were getting away, Charles appeared at the window. Because these armored vehicles were usually disguised as large trucks, their structure was somewhat different from normal armored vehicles. "Step on it!" Dean cried to the driver, his eyes ruthless. He reached for his sword, which glowed white. Before he could draw it, though, a golden light filled the car. He cried out in shock, clutching at his neck as his heart hammered within his chest. Charles's beam of golden light had pierced his throat, and Dean didn't know how that had happened. He thought Charles was one of the surgically enhanced paranormals, so he didn't understand why he had the powers of an elemental. He died before he could work out what was going on. Charles wrenched open the car door and ordered, "Stop the car." The driver immediately stepped on the brake. His voice trembling, he said, "We didn't do it on purpose," he said, his voice trembling. "It was all Dean. He threatened us, so it's not our fault." He was terrified. Dean had not just been a paranormal, but one of the most powerful of them all, and had been at the very top of the food chain. And Charles had taken him out just like that. In a disturbingly calm voice, Charles said, "Get out of the car." There was no way they could disobey him, so they hurried out of the car. As soon as they were out, the angry crowd pounced on them, yelling their disapproval. "That car was our ticket out of here. Kill them!" After Charles had taken care of Dean, he left the car to take stock of the situation. When the crowd saw him approach, they broke apart in a hurry. Only after they had stepped away from the others on the ground did they realize the escapees were no longer breathing. The realization quickly sobered them. Even under such circumstances, murder was something they couldn't accept, so they were quick to try to wash away their crimes. "It wasn't me. I didn't beat them to death. I didn't mean to kill them." Although they had been furious with those who had tried to escape in the car, they hadn't meant it to come to this. When they had turned on the people trying to attack the car, they hadn't known how serious the situation would become. But when people got angry, they could easily lose their minds. So when they had spotted people trying to escape, their moral standards had been cast aside. They were skilled in the ways of martial arts, so although they weren't much more powerful than normal humans, their strength was still formidable. As a result, when they had laid into their victims, their attack had been ruthless. Charles looked at the wounds on the dead bodies. As well as bruises from where they had been struck with fists, he found a few knife wounds too, and those had clearly been the cause of death in most cases. When the crowd saw that he had spotted the knife wounds, they tried to shrink back, pretending nothing had happened. But Charles didn't intend to hold them accountable. "By stealing our vehicles," he said, "these people were trying to take away our access to food and water. And in this world, food and water are not a luxury, but a lifeline. In other words, their escape was an attempt on our lives." Everyone cheered. "You're right! Long live Charles!" With that judgment, Charles had underscored a rule of their new society. Anyone whose actions went against the Alliance should be considered a criminal, as though they had stolen their money or physically assaulted one of them. As a result, it wasn't too high a penalty for such people to be sentenced to death. Although it sounded cruel, in this new era, if anyone showed kindness or forgiveness to such criminals, then they would leave themselves open to an endless stream of people trying their luck with no thought for the consequences. More than a dozen people broke through the swarm of insects to join Charles and the others. "Kevin?" Charles asked, surprised to see him. "Why are you here?" Although the fortress hadn't fallen completely, most of the area was swarming with insects, so he hadn't expected to find Kevin in all the chaos. Kevin looked around and smiled bitterly. "Honestly, I was worried about your safety. But by the looks of things, you know how to look after yourself." "How was the military faring?" Charles asked. "There are just too many bugs," Kevin said, his expression grim. "At night we can hardly see well enough to hit our targets, and we end up hitting people as well as bugs. But the army has no choice. They have to kill as many bugs as possible, whatever the cost." Some of those nearby looked down, shamefaced. One of them was the man who had told Charles the military would have no problems restoring order. "You came at the right time," Charles told Kevin. This isn't an easy place to defend. We'll head for the side of the city wall first and defend from there. Then we'll change places after dawn. Kevin looked at the crowd and nodded. All right, I'll take your lead. Then he turned to the people in military uniforms next to him. These people need to be cleared out of here, so it's down to us to escort them. It was the Army's duty to save and protect the people, so Kevin was giving them a way out of this mess. Everyone fled in the direction of the city wall. Charles knew that the insects' advance wouldn't simply come to an end. The swarms would keep coming until the entire fortress had fallen. But it was late at night, which was hardly the best time to escape. He needed to find them somewhere safe to rest until morning. When the people saw the Dawn Alliance on the move, their eyes lit up. They picked up their bags and approached, hoping to find protection with them. Charles didn't stop them. While he wouldn't take the initiative to help others, he didn't mind if they followed him. His only request was that they not slow him down. Although many people had been injured along the way, most still reached the city wall safely. Charles ordered the healers to treat those who were seriously injured, and then he turned back to continue attacking the bugs. Although his cultivation speed might not be as developed as that of the healers, he could still refine his powers and increase his strength. After dealing with another wave of insects, Kevin came to Charles's side. It was clear there was something he wanted to say, so Charles smiled and said, "Well, come out with it. What's on your mind?" Kevin thought of Charles as a friend, so he didn't beat about the bush. "I've thought it through," he said. "In this chaotic world, we must establish a force of our own. Only then will we be able to make our own rules. If the rest of my family takes charge, it'll be a disaster for everyone." Before this point, Kevin hadn't spent much time thinking about the future. Or rather, he hadn't had the time to think. When he had realized he was able to help people through this disaster, he hadn't been able to commit himself completely to the task. And over time, he had found himself growing more and more powerless to help. Now that the cultivation methods had become the norm, and everyone's fighting skills had developed, he could no longer see what part he played in it all. "I expected you to think of that earlier," said Charles. "What do you plan to do?" "Once your power reaches the 5th tier," Kevin said, "you'll be able to create an energy shield. Behind the shield, you'll be able to give everyone a safe shelter, which will be much safer than a fortress like this. I want to build a shelter too, but I need your help." When the paranormals had first awakened, many people had gained a lot of knowledge, not least concerning energy shields. But maintaining these shields took a heavy price. What's more, there were too few 5th tier paranormals around, so not many people knew how to build them. Surprised, Charles asked, "You have a 5th tier paranormal with you?" "Yes," said Kevin. "It's Lewis. He's already agreed to build a shield for the military at the survival base as a trial." In other words, if this shield was successfully built, then they would be able to do the same at other bases in the future. Charles couldn't believe it. He had expected Lewis to be dead in this timeline, so he was shocked he had reached such an advanced level. But he could clearly see the benefits of nurturing someone like Lewis, no matter how many crystal cores it took, especially since his dealings with the soldier from Montreal. It was clear the military's training had been going well, but Charles didn't want to owe the military too much. "Actually," he said, "I can create energy shields too." "You've also reached the 5th tier?" asked Kevin, shocked. Charles shook his head. "My awakened ability is different. It gives me some 5th tier skills, but I don't want to be involved with the military too much." "If you didn't spend so much time discussing the military," said Kevin, "then I'd almost believe you." Charles had been doing many things under the military's banner lately. Even his parents had taken the initiative to go to the laboratory in Montreal's military district. Although he was a little ashamed that they were so directly involved, he couldn't let his embarrassment show. "I'm not working for the military," he insisted. "I'm only cooperating with them. Think of me as a close business partner, but I'm not joining the company. If you and I are to join forces, then it's vital we agree on this point." "I don't think you hate the military," said Kevin, "but you sure don't see eye to eye. Why?" "Of course I don't hate the military," Charles said. "I respect what they do, but their methods are too impersonal. I'm not an important person like you, so I don't have grand plans and ambitions. All I want is to live with my friends and family around me. So naturally, I'm biased toward the Army. I want to protect my people above all others." That was why Charles hadn't joined the military. They played an important role in protecting others and had a lot of strength behind them. But to Charles, they were too focused on protecting everyone equally, even those who didn't necessarily deserve it. That meant that the people close to Charles had been neglected, which was something he couldn't accept. Perhaps that was a selfish view of things, but Charles was no longer willing to act like the selfish person he had been in his previous life. Not if that meant placing his loved ones in danger. Kevin sighed. "Then I suppose we—" "Hey, Kevin," interrupted Lena, walking over. "What are you guys talking about?" Before Charles had arrived at the fortress, Kevin had saved Harper's life, so Lena was very grateful to him. Kevin smiled and said, "It's nothing. We were just discussing how to make this a safer place." While he could sense Kevin was choosing his words carefully, Charles refused to hide anything from his sister, so he told her everything. After all, he couldn't keep her from learning about the dark and dangerous things of this world. Over time, she had grown stronger and more resilient, which meant that he could teach her more, knowing she could handle it. After he had caught her up to speed, Lena turned to Kevin. "Are you saying that if we can successfully make an energy shield at the survival base, then we'll be able to make more bases in the future?" "That's right," said Kevin. "The survival base needs more than just sleeping quarters. We need to create all kinds of facilities, such as an entertainment area, and many of the existing facilities need to be upgraded. Although the base won't be cut off completely from the outside world, it needs to be as self-sufficient as possible." "Can you guarantee the army will be present at every survival base to maintain order?" Lena asked. Kevin shook his head. "That's impossible. There simply aren't enough troops. If we had soldiers at every base, they'd be spread so few and far between that they would be practically useless." Lena frowned at him. "Then why are you so sure that the survival base built by the military would work as a template for others without the army's involvement?" Kevin was stunned. It was a point he hadn't considered before, but he realized the problem. It would be much harder to establish order without the presence of the military. Even in times of peace, each community had needed an armed guard of some sort. "Why don't we conduct an experiment?" Lena asked. "Let the military build one survival base, and the civilians another. Then we can compare the two and see what improvements each needs." Kevin wasn't the only one taken by the idea. Even some nearby soldiers had been listening intently, and they understood what Lena meant. There was a profound difference between a base that was under the protection of the military and one that was left to its own devices. Charles, seeing the effect of his sister's ideas, decided to strike while the iron was hot. "It's true," he said. "If I made a base of my own, then I could keep the army informed of its strengths and weaknesses, even though the military would not be allowed to interfere with my command." Kevin thought for a moment, and then he smiled. "You've given me an idea," he said. "I can act as the link between you and the army." Charles reached out his hand. "A pleasure doing business with you," he said. Kevin shook his hand. "The pleasure is all mine." Lena grinned. Charles was much more hopeful about the future of the survival bases. He knew he could count on Kevin, and he was glad for his help. If Olivia managed to persuade Miranda and the others, then the team would be almost complete. Once he finished building his forces, they would be able to tackle their enemies. And then, after settling matters in the south, he would be able to head north to make some amends. His priority after securing the protection of his people was to make up for some of the regrets from his previous life. "Next," he said, "I want you all to help me guard this place. I'll build a simple energy shield so that you can see how it's made, and how you can use it." As he spoke, he stepped outside of the group, and streaks of light began to flow from his hands. Where they touched the ground, they blazed into pillars of light, which grew and arced before connecting, shooting even more beams over the group. Everyone watched him work, talking among themselves. "What's he doing?" "I don't know. What are those pillars for?" Then one of them said, "Look, there are more bugs coming." Their attention turned to the swarm of bugs approaching them. They took out their weapons once again, preparing to carry on the fight. But then an incredible thing happened. One bug hit the cage of light that Charles had created, and then it staggered back as though it had hit a wall. Clearly, the bug couldn't believe what had happened, so it tried again, flying at the light before bouncing back once more. The crowd gasped, and their murmurs of doubt and confusion turned to awe. "The light! It's blocking the bugs!" Everyone began to shout, "Charles saved us! He has a shield! He's so powerful!" In the past, Charles's strength had provided his people with a sense of security, but after everyone had witnessed his advanced capabilities, they were all excited and reassured. Although a few people's eyes flashed with jealousy, most of them had nothing but gratitude for him. Regardless of their feelings, they all had one thought in mind, and that was that Charles represented survival. This recent disaster had put their need for survival into perspective. "Everyone don't panic," Charles called out. "We need to kill these bugs. The boundary of the protective shield is limited, so squeeze in and fight with your backs pressed against it." Everyone immediately obeyed. Pillars of light appeared in Charles's hands, and he joined them to form a semicircular shield that he then connected to the city wall. Some small holes were scattered deliberately across the shield to allow bugs into the fortress in controllable numbers. As soon as the insects came through, everyone found it easy to deal with them. Charles also had an additional motive for gathering so many people. Although he had made ample preparations over the days leading to the incident, he still wanted to retain as much of his power of thunder as possible so that he could build his desired survival base. "There's a safe zone!" someone shouted. The protective shield attracted the attention of more people, and they quickly joined Charles's forces. Word about the safe zone spread throughout the city, and people arrived in droves. Even Charles was caught off guard by the number of people who rushed to his side. In his previous life, he had been a solitary person, so he hadn't realized just how much influence he had on the people around him this time. Larger numbers increased their safety, which was enough to spark a flicker of hope inside him. "Are you sure you want all of these people here?" Olivia asked him. "Let them take shelter," he replied. Usually he had no interest in providing charity. He wasn't the type of person to invest himself in the protection of others and expect nothing in return. But he knew the time had come to establish his image, and whatever he did would set a precedent for the future. So he agreed to let the people stay. But as more people surged beneath the protection of the energy shield, the space became increasingly cramped, and everyone started to complain. "Get off me! You're standing on my foot! Someone touched me!" Before the new additions, there had been more than 500 members of the Dawn Alliance within the shield. The number had since swelled to over 2,000. The problems with having a large group of people in such a small space quickly became apparent. Some hungry people started to pick pockets for food. Several even managed to tear holes in their victims' pants. Charles didn't say anything. He sat quietly on the roof of the armored car and observed. He knew they were in for a long night. Once the sun began to rise, many bugs sought refuge in the dark corners of houses and other places where the sunlight couldn't reach them. A few of them were brave enough to face the sun, and they circled the Dawn Alliance from above. Several people shed tears at the sight of the rising sun. They hadn't thought they would live to see the morning. As things began to calm down, people cried out, "It's finally dawn! The bugs have gone! Can we go back now? Are you stupid? They don't like light, but they'll be back. I'm so hungry." Charles knew that despite the reprieve, the terrible insects were still lingering around the fortress. He had no doubt that they would attack again once they had digested their nightly meal. Many people wanted to leave the fortress, but even though they complained about the poor living conditions, most of them came to the same conclusion. Even though this was a dilapidated place, it was still a home, and if they left, they didn't know where to go. Some people fled without even thinking to take food with them. Others borrowed supplies from their friends. Some decided to take the risk and return to their homes to find food. Several paranormals agreed to help people fight their way back to their homes. They thought that although they might not be able to defeat the bugs at night, they stood a good chance of beating them during the day, and they were confident they could make it through the swarm. Kevin sat on the car roof next to Charles and said, "This is a good way to win people's hearts. I suppose you plan to make all these people your subordinates?" Charles shook his head. "No, not yet," he said. Kevin was confused. Why not? Charles's reputation had never been better. People thought highly of him and trusted him, and he also had the means to protect everyone. He could demand to be treated like a god if he wished. When he had spread his martial arts knowledge among the members of the military, he had gained the respect of many soldiers. He could ask practically anything of them, and Kevin was certain they wouldn't reject him. He even suspected they might provide him with an elite force to search for his friends if he asked for it. Charles sighed. "You've been stuck in a military camp for too long," he said. "I'm afraid you have an inflated opinion of both the military's capabilities and people's moral integrity outside the fortress. Most of the people outside are nothing like the ones in here." Charles wasn't about to become complacent. He had spent so many days preparing for what he knew would happen next, and he'd only put his effort into training the military in martial arts because they were already trained in combat. He knew they had the potential to succeed faster than an average person. Lena joined the two men. "Charles, what do you plan to do about the troublemakers in this crowd?" she demanded. "They're causing mayhem. Can't you chase them away?" She had learned not to trust people who took advantage of others for their own gain, but she hadn't yet gained the confidence to assert herself and get rid of them herself. Still, Charles had to admit that he was impressed she had asked him to help, and he was pleased she was becoming more discerning. He shook his head. "You guys keep an eye on them," he instructed. As the threat of the bugs diminished, the degree of chaos within the crowd increased. At one point, a thin man was kicked to the ground. The man who had kicked him was holding a bag, and he was apoplectic with rage. "This is my stuff, you thief!" he screamed at the man on the ground. "You think I'm going to let you get away with stealing from me?" The crowd formed a circle around them, but many of them had become numb to the violence, so they weren't very interested in what would happen. The thin man pointed at the armored car and shouted, "That car is loaded with food!" As soon as the thin man drew the crowd's attention to the car, their eyes began to shine with greed. Charles and his people had never needed to worry about food and clothing, but most of the people inside the fortress hadn't had that luxury. More than a third of them relied on compressed biscuits and rations provided by the army for their survival. It was enough to sustain them, but it wasn't a varied enough diet to keep them happy and sated. Once they had turned their attention to the armored vehicle, all they could think about was the food that was rumored to be inside. That thought was openly expressed by several people in the ravenous crowd. "There's food in there. Let's get it!" But those who wanted to steal from the car came into direct conflict with the people of the Dawn Alliance, who had no intention of allowing their supplies to be taken away. A middle-aged man with a scraggly beard glared at them. "You have so much food. Why don't you share it? Everyone is starving here. Where's your humanity?" The rest of the crowd agreed loudly. "You have so many things. They should be shared. The military gave us food, so why don't you?" Several members of the Alliance became nervous when they were faced with a group of hungry people. Even though they knew the crowd was being unreasonable, they were aware they were outnumbered, so most of them instinctively feared the rabble. The crowd also knew they had numbers on their side. Although none of them had worked for the food, they thought they could take it by force. It didn't matter if they were in the wrong. They just needed enough people to pull it off. "Those are our supplies," a Dawn Alliance member said firmly. "We fought for them. You aren't getting a crumb." "That's right," another agreed. "If you want any of it, then you can exchange something for it. We need to survive too." The supplies were their lifeblood, and they wouldn't part with them willingly. On top of the car, Charles asked Kevin, "What do you think? Should we give these people some of our supplies? Will they be grateful if we do?" Kevin thought for a few seconds, and then he pointed out the people who were hunting down the hibernating insects and killing them. These people were obviously distancing themselves from the troublemakers. "Some of them were worth saving," he commented. "So, what do you plan to do with the ungrateful and unruly ones?" Charles asked. He was interested to hear how Kevin would approach the situation. No matter what kind of social environment they were in, there would always be some degenerates. But during a dangerous time like the apocalypse, the harm those people could cause was potentially devastating. The people of the Dawn Alliance guarded the supplies resolutely. The threatening crowd began to advance on them, searching for potential weaknesses in the blockade. Most of them didn't actively attack the Alliance. Instead, they hovered on the fringe of the action like vultures, waiting to see the outcome. Some of them looked as if they were simply watching a show, as though they didn't want to get involved in the dispute. Charles had to concede that most of the crowd was peaceful and just wanted some stability. They neither helped the rebels nor tried to stop them. Meanwhile, Alice and the others didn't dare act without an order from Charles. But the turning point of the standoff came when a renegade suddenly wielded an axe at a member of the Dawn Alliance who was holding a backpack. The Alliance member was killed instantly, and the man with the axe quickly snatched the backpack from the dead man's hand and tried to make his escape. The stupid man hadn't even considered how he could get away with this crime. Instead, his instinct to eat had taken over every part of his mind. He had waited for an opportunity to achieve his goal, and he had taken it. "He's dead!" someone shouted, pointing at the fallen man. There had been a lot of casualties from the insect attack the previous night, and the losses had been considerable. But there was still an unspoken understanding that the insects were less evolved beings that killed as part of their genetic programming. Watching someone kill another person so callously for their possessions caused panic on a different scale to that of the previous night. Then more people began to attack. "Give us the food or we'll take it ourselves," one of them snarled. "Let's get them!" yelled another. Charles was aware that when people were faced with a disaster, it was easy for them to lose their minds. Once a person took the opportunity to revert to a primitive mindset, there was no stopping them. And then, like a domino effect, it acted as an impetus for others. Kevin rushed into the fray, pointing his finger at the man who had stolen the backpack. Then he raised his blade, killing the man on the spot. By this point, the crowd had descended into chaos, and the justice Kevin had served was lost amid a sea of angry people, all acting on their basic instincts to survive. The Dawn Alliance finally counterattacked. Wind blades, sword lights, blade energy, and fireballs filled the sky, and the Alliance killed anyone who tried to steal their supplies. As they fought, they called out to each other, "Protect our resources! Kill the thieves! Take down these sons of bitches!" To protect the resources they relied on to survive, the members of the Alliance shot to kill. Many of them had already killed countless monsters over the previous days, and the night before, they'd killed an enormous swarm of bugs. Petty thieves didn't stand a chance against them. As a result, a chaotic and mostly one-sided battle erupted. Although there were a few paranormals among the people who had decided to steal the resources, the group of attackers was still very much a minority. Soon, under the counterattack of the Alliance, they began to fall. Kevin guarded the exit points of the energy shield, killing any of the would-be thieves who attempted to escape during the chaos. Lena remained beside Charles and watched the carnage. She was almost in a daze, and she couldn't believe what she was seeing. "Why are they like this?" she asked him. "We saved them all last night." The refugees who had previously been victims had turned into demons in the blink of an eye. But then again, to protect their own food, the members of the Alliance had also allowed themselves to become killers. Charles shook his head. "They're not really doing it to survive," he said. "Everyone in this fortress has access to food from the military. They simply want to live better lives and eat better food. But if you ask any of them, they'll say it's because their lives are unfair. I suppose, really, they all just want to purge their fear." There were still people outside the fortress who regularly starved to death. People came into the city knowing that the military's presence meant they would have access to protection and essentials. They knew people inside the fortress didn't starve. Charles didn't know the answer to Lena's question. Perhaps it was due to the pressure from the outside world, or else because of the dejection and feelings of hopelessness people had. But he did know that the reason wasn't important. To the members of the Alliance, these people were bandits who wanted to rob them of their resources and would kill them without hesitation. Lena didn't say anything. The scene had changed how she viewed the world. She had thought she had recently gained an understanding of how things were, but she hadn't realized just how far people would go to survive. Sometimes, she thought, the difference between humans and beasts isn't their motivation for violence, but rather their environment. Alice sat beside Lena and comforted her. "I know it doesn't seem like it," Alice said softly, "but there are still many good people in this world. We have companions that we can trust. There are always going to be people who will give their lives for others. Even Charles has done it." Lena blinked in surprise. "Really?" she asked. She felt slightly guilty for assuming the worst of her brother, but the Charles she had come to know in recent days was far different from the boy she remembered from childhood. Alice pointed at the thief who had been executed by Kevin. "Are you willing to become like him?" she asked. Lena shook her head. "Of course not." She had no intention of ending up like a dead man who had sacrificed his life to steal from others. "If you knew beforehand that he would kill one of our people for food, would you have stopped him?" Alice asked. Lena was silent. In the past, she would have immediately said yes, but after what she had just witnessed, she was conflicted. "In this new era, we don't always have many choices," Charles said. If we don't use force to deal with these bandits, they will simply continue to risk our lives, only to be robbed by them. Lena struggled for a moment, and then said, "I understand." Kevin reappeared on Charles's other side, having overheard his comment. "You're right," he said. "Not everyone is worth saving. We can't drag along a handful of people who are only one disaster away from turning into bandits." Suddenly, a woman startled everyone by screaming at the Dawn Alliance members. "You're a bunch of murdering devils! All of you! You're all butchers and executioners!" She had an intense look of rage on her face. Witnessing the massacre of fellow human beings had left a massive impact on her psyche. It seemed as though the incident had caused significant damage to her mental state, and she seemed to be on the verge of collapse. But in the face of her accusations, instead of feeling pity for this woman or examining their own actions, several of the Alliance members' eyes filled with anger. The only thing that stopped them from killing the woman was their own sense of self-preservation. Killing bandits could be considered self-defense, but killing a hysterical woman for simply making a commentary on the events would be cold-blooded murder. Before his people did something they would regret, Charles stood up and shouted, "People from the Dawn Alliance, gather!" When they heard Charles's voice, the members of the Alliance appeared to regain their faculties. Olivia and the others also looked at Charles, waiting to see what he would do. Charles knew that they had reached a crucial point. Most members of the Alliance were at their weakest, which meant he would have the most control over them. He knew that his performance the previous night had undoubtedly brought his reputation to its peak. "Now's the moment I'll see how many people will willingly work for me," he thought. He knew that few would object because the price of defying him was too high. "We've all suffered an unprecedented disaster," he told the attentive crowd. "This is a dangerous era, one where survival isn't a right, it's a luxury. We must face countless monsters and be wary of evil people." His words struck a chord in many people's hearts. Some of them even shed a few tears. It wasn't that he was a particularly good orator. It was simply that they were all experiencing a moment of vulnerability. They all felt they were unlucky enough to be experiencing the worst time humanity had ever faced, and were somehow expected to fix it. "However," Charles continued, "throughout the history of this great country, there have been many disasters. We had casualties in every war, but our ancestors survived their challenges. They fought against evil, tyranny, and terrible circumstances. No matter what came at them, they never gave up hope of survival. By doing so, they paved the way for us to succeed. They gave us a chance to live." The crowd felt the emotion of Charles's speech. Hope began to swell inside them, which was something many of them hadn't felt in a long time. "The disasters we faced in the past were, at the time, unprecedented," Charles told them. "But our ancestors didn't allow those atrocities to be the end of the human race." His words evoked a sense of pride that many of them had thought they would never feel again. Charles continued, "The blood that flows in our veins is a gift to us from our ancestors. It's the blood of people who never yield. It's blood that holds the memories of our history and our culture, and it gives us the unyielding spirit to fight. I believe that, as long as we are willing to fight, we can continue our family lines. We can use the fighting spirit within us to make our ancestors proud." A fire ignited within the hearts of his people. "We are still American," Charles assured them, "and where our ancestors succeeded and survived, so will we. Through our blood and our willpower, we will survive." Most of the members of the Dawn Alliance had determined looks in their eyes. They knew that while the weaker people in the fortress had eaten their biscuits and waited to die, or else had allowed themselves to revert to primitive instincts and base urges, the Alliance had found the strength to continue. Many of them had joined the Alliance because they had wanted more, and they had been willing to fight for it. When they had chosen to join, they had chosen the path of humanity, so they all had the courage to stay positive in the face of adversity. Charles's speech hadn't enabled them to unlock any undiscovered powers, but it had reminded them of their existing courage. "I can't promise you anything," Charles said, "except that I will work hard. We can work together and use everything we have to survive." The crowd called out in response, "We must survive! Let's choose humanity! Yes! We are better than animals!" In the face of human suffering, the Dawn Alliance, which had originally been a small, slightly disorganized operation, had experienced a rebirth into an impressive force, powered by determination and strength. Kevin sighed and said, "I've probably heard better speeches, but the people do seem to like it." "Do you know how religious organizations manage to control people for so long?" Tina replied with a wry smile. "They realize they could convince anyone of pretty much anything if their followers are desperate enough, afraid enough, and had a willingness to believe." Sylvia frowned. She disagreed strongly with Tina's assessment, but she did see the effect that Charles had on the people. "It doesn't really matter by what means we get the support," Alice said. "It's a fact that, when everyone is united, it's easier to survive." At that moment, someone who had previously been cowering in a corner asked, "Can I join you guys?" The source of the voice was a man in his 30s who was wearing a tattered suit and looked a little unkempt. When the crowd of refugees heard his request, their eyes lit up, and many of them looked at Charles with hope. Charles had anticipated such a thing. It was time for the Dawn Alliance to gather more followers, so he had every intention of letting them all stay. As long as they were willing, he would accept anyone who wanted to join. The circumstances under which they joined meant they would hopefully be easy to command, but he also knew he had to stand by his previous conditions for entry. After all, they weren't a charity. Olivia and the others smiled pityingly at the crowd of people. A youth with a crew cut asked Olivia, "Why do I feel like you're all going to hold our past actions against us?" The other alliance leaders were annoyed at such a sanctimonious display of self-pity, and they glared at the youth. In the past, they had painstakingly recruited members, tugged on people's heartstrings, and built trust by treating their subordinates with the greatest care, all so that they could expand their influence. When many of these people had tried to overthrow Charles, they had been prepared to fight for power. A few of them had even spread rumors and blatantly questioned Charles's abilities. It had only been when the disaster had arrived that they had all come crawling back to ask for protection. They had seen Charles as a protective figure who could give them a sense of security and make them feel at ease. Charles replied firmly, "Simply joining the Alliance won't entitle you to any benefits. We don't give anything out for free, not even food or water. What we do give you is an opportunity to pick up a weapon, gather your courage, and fight these monsters with us. You can collect the monsters as corpses and crystal cores, and exchange those with me for anything you want." Many people sighed in disappointment and thought of leaving, but far more of them looked determined. "We will join," they shouted. "We will fight the monsters." Charles turned to Olivia and the others. "Over to you," he said. Recruiting members and arranging positions for new recruits was their responsibility. Charles had never wasted his time on such matters. He was the first to admit his personal skills were less than impressive. His job was to be a figurehead, and he assumed that responsibility gladly. Strength was the foundation of their group, and that was something he could provide. A short-haired young man addressed Charles. "I apologize for our behavior," he said. "I'm sure we all know now that we should rely on you if we want to survive." Countless people had lost their lives during the bug attack, and even paranormals had been cut down and attacked in their sleep. Someone else added, "We never stood a chance at overthrowing you." "That's right," a third person joined in. "You must have thought it was so funny because we're so weak compared to you." No matter whether they believed what they were saying, everyone knew that Charles was the most powerful person in the fortress. The Neal family had fallen, so everyone needed to appeal to Charles's better nature. "If I want to make the Alliance an iron force," Charles said reasonably, "I can't do it alone. We need to support each other. I don't object to people starting their own teams, but there needs to be a bottom line. That bottom line is that the interests of the collective take precedence above everything else." "Our alliance is everyone's alliance," Olivia promised. "I believe we can survive, but I won't let people get hurt." She believed in people's intelligence, and she also believed that anyone with a brain knew that the use of force was the only way to maintain order. While Charles and Olivia addressed the crowd, Kevin had made a decision. He located a few remaining members of the military. "I know you don't want to sacrifice anyone," he said, "but our reality is much crueler than I think we all expected. If you continue with your previous plan, then you will lose more people than if you just took simple action right now." The most senior remaining member of the military saluted Kevin and said, "We'll consider your opinion, I'm on a different path to you, Kevin told him, but I hope that doesn't mean we have to be enemies. We couldn't become enemies with people who have helped us, the man assured him. The Kevin in Charles's current timeline had walked a very different path to the one in his previous existence. His martial arts training had helped the military more than Charles had expected, and he had subsequently saved countless lives. Despite the military's occasional grievances with the Dawn Alliance, they had a great deal of respect for Kevin. It was a different relationship than they had with Charles, who had repeatedly tested their gratitude and was only tolerated for his contributions. Lena smiled when she realized Kevin was preparing to team up with Charles. For the remainder of the day, people who hadn't managed to get enough sleep took it in turns to do so. Under Olivia's command, everyone also assumed their new respective positions, and the division of labor was arranged in an orderly manner. In the past, Olivia had controlled her family's business. Although she had simplified her story and had made it sound easy, anyone who had experienced the business world knew what kind of control she would have needed to exert to see such an organization from older and more powerful members of her family. She had an amazing ability to lead others while retaining their respect and admiration. She said to her new subordinates, "Charles intends to build a special residence within the fortress, and it will be surrounded by a protective shield. There are limitations to its construction, but he's hoping that it will be fortified enough to ensure that no one is killed by bugs while they sleep." Everyone was excited at the prospect of such a haven. They already knew that the fortress was no longer the safest place to be, but if Charles was going to use some of his incredible powers to create a safe space, they were on board with the idea 100%. Even if Charles wasn't enough of a draw to inspire loyalty, many people had already started to treat their comrades as though they were family. When the Dawn Alliance began to organize themselves, some people who had been on the verge of madness due to hunger began to hunt insects to exchange them for food. Charles also wasn't idle. Since he intended to build a survival base, he knew everything needed to have a purpose, so he collaborated with Kevin. "The most important thing is to stabilize our food source," Charles said. "At the moment, we can search for food, but we won't be able to do that in the long term." He opened a map that he had found in a kiosk. "Our best choice is to relocate to the countryside," he said. "There's a lot of suitable farmland near Montreal that we can choose from." "We can't rely on old buildings in the countryside," Kevin argued. "And there are no borders, so we can't guarantee our safety. The buildings are stronger and safer in the city." "Can't you see that these buildings are getting less and less secure?" Charles asked. "Buildings made of concrete and bricks don't necessarily guarantee our safety." Kevin frowned. "But what should we do?" he asked. "It's not easy to build a fortress, and we don't have the resources. We might have salvaged some electronics and machines, but we don't have anything on the scale we would need." "We don't need machines," Charles insisted. "Earth paranormals are the best architects. If they work with fire paranormals, then they can create sturdy homes. The only things we need to worry about are finding larger buildings and daily necessities. We can find resources in the city for now until we cultivate enough crops." But Kevin still seemed gloomy. According to rough estimates, the population around Montreal already exceeded 60%. Roughly 30% of the population had turned into zombies, and the others were waiting to become food for the monsters. If the statistics were accurate and the ratio was applied to the US, then the country had lost several 100 million people. It was a terrifying number. Charles continued, "If you insist on ensuring stability in the house structures, then we can either find some metal paranormals or use bones from zombies or wild beasts. That will reinforce the structures." Kevin nodded, but he felt a little suspicious because Charles seemed a little too confident. But he didn't ask too many questions because he knew he wouldn't get a straight answer. Since he had decided to follow Charles, he knew he needed to trust him. As the two of them discussed their options, Olivia popped in. "Hey, Charles," she said. "We're really getting through our food stores. Do you have anything else we can exchange?" Because the number of people in the Alliance had suddenly increased, bugs were being massacred in droves. Charles had promised to exchange food in return for the dead bodies, but the response had been so enthusiastic that they were quickly running low on supplies. "Wait a moment," he replied. "I'll get some from the car." He flipped off the car roof and took out a few boxes of canned food and water. He gave them to Olivia, along with some medications and daily necessities. The others were unaware that the car was just a facade. Most of Charles's assets were actually located in his energy storage space. He relied on the complicated structure of the armored vehicle to trick the others into thinking there was more space inside it than there was. But Olivia was smart. She hesitated for a moment, and then she said, "Everyone is exchanging medicinal crystal cores and insect corpses for food, and we're giving away too many of our supplies. Shouldn't we consider raising the price or limiting exchanges? We need to ration the water to make it last." "I completely understand where you're coming from," Charles said, "but everyone has been through a lot, and a lot of them are new. We'll do our best to provide what we can. Soon they'll see there are plenty of resources, and the bartering will slow down. Once people have enough food and water to last them several days, you can make some changes and ask them to bring other things." To Charles, the entire process was a joke. The corpses and crystal cores of the bugs helped him to increase his strength. Even if he wasted some of his resources, it was no trouble to find more. Currently, he had more than 2,000 members in the Alliance, and every one of them was effectively working for free. He didn't want to waste the opportunity, and he knew what he was planning to do was dangerous, so this wasn't the time to slow down. Olivia shrugged and continued to take the retrieved items to Charles and distributed the supplies as requested. She wasn't responsible for making any decisions, and she knew better than to try to do Charles's job for him. Charles passed a crystal core to Sylvia. "After purifying these medicinal crystal cores, you and Alice need to split up," he told her. "The more your strength increases, the more helpful it will be. Use your abilities to help some of the injured, but make sure you charge for your services. It doesn't need to be much, but it absolutely cannot be free." Sylvia nodded obediently. To her, Charles's words were an imperial decree. No matter what was asked, she would carry it out meticulously. Alice scowled. "And what about me?" she asked. "Is my power completely useless?" "What are you talking about?" Charles asked, laughing. "Without your superpower, how could I enjoy a nice cold beverage?" Alice felt as if he had plunged a knife into her heart. "Was that supposed to make me feel better?" she demanded. "You know, it's a good thing you're useful in a crisis, because at any other time in history, you'd be single all your life." She stormed off to join the medicinal group. Charles shook his head, not sure why she was so angry. Surely she can see how valuable it is to have drinking water in a survival scenario, he thought. Once Charles had given the medicinal crystal cores to Sylvia and the others, he began refining the corpses of the bugs. In the days preceding the attack, he had prepared many medicinal extract amulets at the cost of his cultivation speed. It had been a blow to him at the time, because he had known he would soon have to deal with not only a swarm of insects, but also the threat of the Neal family. But at the moment, his top priority was to raise his power level. He had collected countless bug corpses, which enabled him to rapidly increase his strength. With such resources, Charles's strength quickly reached the 3rd and 9th level, and then he reached a bottleneck. This wasn't due to insufficient energy, but because, once he had reached the 3rd tier, all the power of thunder he collected was absorbed by the energy storage space. No matter how much power he absorbed, his overall level couldn't surpass the 3rd tier. Did I increase my strength too quickly? He wondered. In my previous life, I didn't have a good cultivation environment, so my progress was slower. It looks like my plan to deal with stellar technology will have to wait. Charles wasn't impatient, though. He continued to refine the bug corpses and converted them into power of thunder.